Linda Thompson leaned against the counter of her small kitchen, staring at the final notice on her overdue electric bill. Her hands trembled as she placed the paper down, her thoughts racing. How had it come to this? A year ago, she had been working full-time at the local manufacturing plant, earning enough to keep her family afloat. But layoffs had changed everything, leaving her struggling to find work and support her two children, Ava and Jake. She had sent out countless job applications since being laid off, applying to positions in retail, customer service, and even part-time labor. But each rejection email that came through her inbox chipped away at her confidence. Employers told her she was either overqualified, underqualified, or not the right fit. It felt like every door she knocked on refused to open. One afternoon, Linda's frustrations boiled over when she overheard her neighbor talking about a new hire at the grocery store where Linda had recently applied. The position had gone to an international student, someone who didn't even live in the area full-time. Linda couldn't help but feel betrayed. She had grown up in this town, supported its businesses, and raised her kids here. Why don't they want to hire someone local? She muttered under her breath. The resentment grew as she noticed a pattern. Many of the jobs she had applied for were being filled by immigrant workers or international students. They worked long hours, often for lower wages, and seemed to be the preferred choice for employers. Linda couldn't understand why people like her, longtime residents who were struggling, were being overlooked. It wasn't just about the job rejections anymore. It was about what those rejections represented. As Linda stood in line at the food bank one evening, she overheard a group of young international students talking about their shifts at a nearby warehouse. Their laughter and lighthearted conversation stung. For them, these jobs seemed like temporary opportunities. For Linda, they were a lifeline her family desperately needed. Her frustration bubbled into anger as she returned home that night, staring at her children's worn-out backpacks and the nearly empty refrigerator. Why are they taking over our jobs? She thought bitterly. She couldn't shake the feeling that the system was leaving people like her behind. Linda knew she couldn't keep quiet anymore. Something had to change, and she was determined to find answers, no matter how uncomfortable the journey might be. Linda's frustration only grew in the weeks that followed. Every job she applied for seemed to slip through her fingers, and she couldn't ignore the common thread she was noticing. Many of the roles she'd sought were going to immigrants or international students. It wasn't just hearsay, her neighbor had confirmed it, and her own observations at the grocery store and warehouse seemed to validate her suspicions. An unsettling observation. One afternoon, Linda was running errands when she stopped by a coffee shop for a brief reprieve. As she sipped her coffee, she overheard a group of young people speaking in a language she didn't recognize. She caught snippets of their conversation in English. They were discussing their work schedules and upcoming shifts at a nearby retail chain where she had also applied. "I got extra hours this week," one of them said, smiling. "Me too," another chimed in. "That's going to help a lot for next semester's tuition." Linda's chest tightened as she listened. She tried to focus on her coffee, but she couldn't shake the bitterness rising within her. These students were using the same jobs she needed to pay for things like groceries and rent for their own educational expenses and side projects. It felt unfair, as though locals like her were being pushed aside in favor of workers who could afford to take lower pay or work more flexible hours. The tipping point. The breaking point came when Linda attended a community job fair, hoping to connect with local employers. She dressed in her best, brought a carefully prepared resume, and made sure to arrive early. But as she walked through the booths, her optimism began to wane. Many of the tables were staffed by recruiters who seemed to favor younger, more energetic candidates. When she reached the booth for a retail chain, she couldn't help but notice the recruiters chatting enthusiastically with a group of international students. One of the recruiters barely glanced at Linda's resume before thanking her politely and turning back to the students. As Linda walked back to her car, humiliation and anger bubbled to the surface. She thought about how hard she had worked her entire life, only to feel invisible in her own community. What's the point of trying if they don't even see me, she thought. Speaking out. That evening, Linda attended a town hall meeting where local residents were invited to voice their concerns about employment and the local economy. When the floor opened for public comments, she hesitated before raising her hand. "I have something to say," she began, her voice trembling. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I've worked hard to provide for my kids, but now I can't even get a job at the grocery store because it seems like all the positions are going to people who aren't even from here." Her words were met with a mix of murmurs and applause. Some attendees nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "It's not fair," Linda continued, emboldened by the response. "What about people like me, local workers who are struggling to make ends meet? Shouldn't we get a chance before jobs are handed to someone who's only here temporarily?" As Linda sat down, a man named Raj stood up to respond. He was an immigrant who had lived in the town for several years and worked 2 jobs to support his family. "I understand your frustration," Raj said, his tone calm. "But I think there's a misunderstanding about people like me. We're not here to take jobs from anyone. We're just trying to survive, just like you. Many of us work long hours in tough conditions because we don't have a choice." A difficult realization. Raj's words stayed with Linda as she walked home that night. She didn't want to admit it, but his perspective had given her pause. She thought about the international students she'd seen and the sacrifices they might be making to pursue their education. Were they really to blame for her struggles? Later, Ava, her 10-year-old daughter, brought home a new friend from school, a girl named Mira, whose family had recently immigrated to the area. As Linda chatted with Mira's parents during a play date, she learned about their challenges. Both worked long hours at multiple jobs to make ends meet, often taking shifts that others didn't want. "People think we're lucky to get these jobs," Mira's mother said, "but they don't see how hard it is to juggle everything. We're just trying to give our kids a better future." Linda felt a pang of guilt as she listened. It wasn't that she stopped feeling frustrated about her own situation, but she began to realize that the problem wasn't as simple as she had thought. Finding common ground. Determined to channel her frustration into something productive, Linda reached out to Raj and other members of the immigrant community. They met at the local library where Linda shared her concerns and listened to their stories. Together, they identified shared challenges: low wages, limited job training, and a lack of opportunities for both locals and immigrants. Raj suggested organizing a community event where residents could discuss solutions, such as advocating for fair wages and expanding local job training programs. Linda hesitated at first, worried about how people might react, but she knew that staying silent wouldn't change anything. A collaborative effort. The event, held at the town hall, was a turning point. Local residents, immigrants, and international students came together to share their experiences. Linda spoke openly about her struggles as a single mother, while Raj shared his perspective as an immigrant trying to support his family. The discussion sparked new ideas, such as creating mentorship programs to help local workers develop new skills, and encouraging businesses to invest in both local and immigrant communities. A glimmer of hope. As Linda walked home from the event, she felt a small but significant shift in her perspective. Her anger hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced by a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, she felt like she was part of a solution instead of simply a victim of circumstances. The story continues as Linda works with her community to create opportunities for everyone, including herself. Months after the community event, Linda found herself standing at the town hall once again, this time helping set up for a local job fair she had helped organize. The event was the result of months of collaboration between local residents, business owners, and members of the immigrant community. What had once felt like an insurmountable divide was beginning to bridge, one conversation at a time. As she arranged brochures on a table, Raj walked over, carrying a stack of name tags for volunteers. "It's amazing how far this has come," he said, placing the stack down. "When we first met, I didn't think anything like this was possible." Linda smiled, her expression tinged with humility. "I didn't either. I was so angry back then. At you, at the system, at everything. But I've learned a lot since then." Raj nodded thoughtfully. "We all have. It's been tough, but I think we've shown what can happen when people work together instead of against each other." A new perspective. The job fair was a resounding success. Local residents and immigrants alike found opportunities tailored to their skills, while businesses began exploring ways to create inclusive hiring practices. Linda was particularly proud of the job skills workshop she had helped organize. which offered training in resume building and interview techniques for anyone in need. Watching Ava and Jake run around with Mira and her siblings during the event, Linda felt a deep sense of accomplishment. What had started as a journey fueled by anger and frustration had transformed into something meaningful, not just for her, but for her entire community. Reflection and growth. That evening, as Linda walked home, she thought back to the months of struggle she had endured. The bitterness and resentment that had consumed her felt like a distant memory. She now understood that her frustration hadn't been with the people she had blamed, but with a system that often left everyone, locals and immigrants alike, scrambling for scraps. She still faced challenges. Her financial situation wasn't perfect, and there were days when it felt like progress was moving at a snail's pace, but she had found a way to channel her energy into solutions, and that made all the difference. Looking ahead. Linda paused in front of her house, watching Ava and Jake laugh as they carried their leftover brochures inside. She smiled, feeling a rare but welcome sense of hope. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shown her the power of empathy and collaboration. For the first time in a long time, Linda believed in the possibility of a better future, not just for herself, but for everyone.